Hey now, good morning, happy Thursday, PSW staff, clients, friends joining us. Okay, it's an LA class, but we had a good week so far. Tomorrow we see your film scoring results for The Never-Ending Story, 1984 fantasy film. Hope you enjoy some of these old classics. We'll be doing some newer action movies too, and a lot of other stuff in the future. But it was good yesterday looking at Dave Brubeck. Very, had vision problems, but used his ear like Chet Baker. Using your ear and your heart. That's the most important. Training is good too, but that should come secondary. And all those irregular time signatures, the 3/4, the 5/4, the 9/8. It just varies it up a little bit, varies music up a little bit. You don't have to have those complexities, but a little spice. It's just like Taco Bell's fine too, but then sometimes like a gourmet meal, something with the different spices, is interesting. Some people like that. Okay, so today we're going to look at, it's kind of a weird subject, but I thought it would be fun to look at certain important names that we drive around all the time because well, we're starting to now that everything's opening up, but we see these signs everywhere. So today we're going to be looking at Los Angeles street names. Streets you think are in Los Angeles about. Probably more than 10, right? There's 50,000 streets in Los Angeles County. We'll be going through each one, so get comfortable. It's probably going to be a 10-hour class. But we'll talk about the history of, we're going to recap our LA history because it's good to understand, where we are right now. How did we get here? So we're going to look at some of the earliest street names, some that have changed. There's way too many to go through, but just, what are these names that we say all the time? Take La Brea to Fairfax to Melrose. It's like the Californians. And, we talked about freeways in LA. So now we're doing side streets in LA. Okay, so we talked about last week about the 44 founders of Los Angeles, because Los Angeles started 1781, right? And they came from San Gabriel, the Mission, and they came on Mission Road down to Alvarado Street. So Mission Road is the first street that we're going to be talking about. It was dusty back then, probably still is, but this was a Native American trail from San Gabriel near the LA River. So they settled there and they said, this is it, guys. A lot of these early street names in Los Angeles were where farms and homes were of the locals, So when you think about it, if there's no streets or any paved way, it's like go over there to John's farm and then Joe's farm is to the left. So that was basic, that's probably the whole world how you do that. So we know that if LA was 1781, California wasn't a state yet with the America, right? It wasn't until the gold rush came, whereas America said, maybe we'll take California, That sounds good now that there's money to be made off California. And that's about 1847, but let's just stay 1850. Come on. 1850 is also when General Edward Ord, so he was an engineer for the United States Army and fought in a lot of wars. And so they hired him, city officials, Los Angeles officials hired him to survey all the public lands in LA County because they wanted to sell them. This is before Harry Chandler was really getting into real estate. They needed to sell them, so they hired him as a surveyor. So he and his assistant mapped Los Angeles in the year 1849. They took about 2 months, and so most of the street names are from that year. And historians say that they have a really good, the work that Ord and his assistant did, that's pretty good. They got a good view of what Los Angeles looked like in the middle of the 19th century, a long time ago. So Ord was paid $3,000 for his work, or he could have gotten 160 acres of public land, which is like 10 building sites in downtown. But he wanted the $3,000 instead. I don't know. Probably would have been worth way more, right, if he would have taken the land, but he wanted to be paid instead. So after they do that, the 1850s, those following decades, more people would name stuff. A lot of these names came from places that people had come from, where they missed home. Alvarado Street's big. That's for the Mexican governor, Juan Bautista Alvarado. Adams isn't that far from our school. That's for President John Adams. Washington, for, yeah, you guessed it, George Washington. Pico is a big street. We haven't looked at the Pico House, but that's one of the oldest homes in Los Angeles. Not as old as the Avila House that we looked at with Alvarado Street, but Pico Boulevard. It was named in 1855 for Don Pio Pico. And his grandfather and father had come to the area around 1776, so it had a lot of history there. And so he was born at the San Gabriel Mission in 1801, and so he built the Pico House, which was the first 3-story house in Los Angeles, and that's still there. It's close to Alvarado Street. You can still tour it. Figueroa is a huge one, right? And that's the Mexican governor Jose Figueroa in 1855. We know Alvarado Street, we talked about, that was named after the judge, right? The first judge of LA County in 1858, Agustin Alvera. We talked about the La Brea tar pits years ago, and we know that, so 1869 is when La Brea is named, La Brea Avenue, and La Brea means tar, right? And it's that funny thing when we said, well, the La Brea tar pits, La Brea is the tar, so it's the tar pits. So when we say, it's kind of funny because you wouldn't say that, but we all say these things, and we'll talk about some of these controversial names later, about how pronunciations rather. So when we get to the 1880s, it's huge growth, right? We talk about this every week because of the railroad. So now it's huge, and everyone's coming to get up land. And so about 1887, about 169 new street names are added because people are, they need directions and all of these things. So, but it's interesting, around this time, mostly all of Los Angeles was all Spanish speaking. So English was kind of the minority until about the 1880s. So lest anyone think white people were here first, it was mostly people. It wasn't until people from the Midwest came and English kind of became the primary language. People from the East Coast, the Midwest, people from Indiana coming to Pasadena. It's like random, states coming here. Melrose Avenues, Melrose Street's one of the most famous. 1887, named after a rancher. McCarthy named it after his hometown, Melrose, in Massachusetts. So we talked about early Hollywood development, right? So Hollywood's named in 1884, but it doesn't really become a part of LA County until a few decades later. But we know that the Daida Wilcox and Harvey Wilcox, that couple, they came from Kansas, right? And then she named it Hollywood because her neighbor thought, gave her the idea for that name. There's some gray areas about how, but they named Hollywood, and they were not movie people at all. This was way before movies came. They were teetotalers. They would give you free land if you had a church, if you owned a church. They were very religious people. So when they saw these silent films being made, that was not a good idea for them. So they took all these buggy rides into these canyons in Los Angeles, and that's where Cahuenga Valley comes from. Silver Lake neighborhood was called Ivanhoe because it reminded people of these big hills, rolling hills in Silver Lake. So a lot of those streets had Scottish-inspired names, just because, like Rowena and things like that. So it was called Silver Lake right around 1907. By about 1893, we get the famous Rodeo Drive. We've looked at that. Remember, that was Beverly Hills. That was racing, car racing, right near Rodeo, right? So it was part of Rancho Rodeo, meaning gathering of the waters. Wilshire Boulevard is one of the most famous. Gaylord Wilshire, we've talked about that idea before. He was a big real estate investor, and this was going west of downtown because that's where Bullock's Wilshire is, but that's not till 1927. So 1895 is when Gaylord names it Wilshire, and that's the Gaylord Apartments, of course. Sunset Boulevard, probably the most famous, right? Maybe. First appeared 1888 is when Sunset Boulevard was on the books, and it was just a dirt road. It was a 600-foot dirt road near near the old plaza. So Sunset goes, from, Alvarado Street pretty much to the beach, give or take some side streets. By the 1920s, more people are just coming out, right? It's biggest year is 1923 for street names. About 500 new street names are recorded that year. La Cienega and Canoga and Bigsby and all of these things were recorded. And then we had the Olympics. Also, another thing I was thinking about, palm trees. People are really, there's palm trees everywhere in Los Angeles. That was because the Olympics came. And that's also why we have Olympic Boulevard, which is 10th Street. If you count the streets, there's no 10th Street Boulevard, or in LA, because it's 9th Street. Then there's 11th Street. But Olympic was named in 1929 in honor of the upcoming Olympics, which happened in 1932. And because of those Olympics, we planted all of these, like, thousands and thousands of palm trees, because when the world was going to come to LA, we wanted to look pretty. We did a whole class on Abbott Kenny. He made a fortune in tobacco. 1905 is when Venice opens, and he tries to make it look like the Venice Canal. They built canals, right? We talked about that. So Abbott Kenny is named, obviously named after him. Huntington out in San Gabriel, San Marino, Henry Huntington, which was the Huntington Library, which was the big, trains and railroads, and he made a fortune. The famous congested Mulholland was named after William Mulholland. He was, super important for bringing water to Los Angeles. Some would say stealing water from the Owens River Valley. And then, like I said, there's certain pronunciations, because people say Los Angeles, Los Angeles. There's so many different things I was reading. It's ridiculous to go through them. A big one is Los Feliz. And some article I was reading was like this was the biggest debate over all the street names of how do you pronounce this, Los Feliz. People say that, but locals and Angelinos don't say that. We say Los Feliz for some reason. So when you hear Los Feliz, maybe it's a newcomer that means well, but we just don't play that game. But yeah, pronunciations are interesting, because sometimes, like, we know we're wrong, but there's certain right things to say, and then there's certain wrong things that show that you're right. That's just part of evolution, living in Los Angeles and all that stuff. So I hope you enjoyed it. I know this was kind of an odd class, but there's big street names, and there's so many other big ones, but I just thought we'd tackle the big ones, the famous ones that, where tourists come and say, I want to see Hollywood Boulevard. I want to see Melrose. I want to see Sunset. There were a lot of these things were named. Some were just named after people. Some were named after farmers. Some were named because they were homesick of back east, so they would, call it Melrose. Interesting things. And some live on Clump Street. Clump Street's a funny street, and that's kind of an inside joke. But okay, so tomorrow, film scoring results for Never Ending Story. Can't wait to show you that. And have a great rest of the day. Okay, bye.